There's a reason the most Eurosceptic people in Ireland are fishermen, because they're the one set of people who haven't had an economic benefit from European Union membership. It's gone the other direction.
Today we're discussing Brexit. We're joined by John McGuirk. And John, we brought you on today to ask what your own thoughts are about the Brexit process and also the Irish media's depiction of it.
Well, I think we'll start with the Irish media. And, to one extent, naturally enough, they take a very Irish-centric view of it. But I think that has kind of led to a lack of understanding amongst the audience of the Irish media as to why the British people voted for Brexit in the first place. And oftentimes when I hear Brexit discussed in Ireland and I hear it discussed on our television and our radio programs, it's like this, evil act that is being perpetrated upon Ireland with malice and aforethought by the establishment in London. And I think that's very far from the truth. I think when you talk to people who are advocates of Brexit in the UK, their views are basically along the lines of, we want to be able to trade with the rest of the world, we want to be able to make our own laws, we want to be able to take control of our own destiny. And whether you agree with the process by which they've gone through that in Brexit or not, those are perfectly reasonable aspirations that people have had since we first learned how to walk and talk. So I think there's been a degree of demonization of Brexiteers that has been unhelpful and has probably done harm to the relationship between these two islands. And equally, by the way, to be fair, you'd have to say that in some cases, some of these Brexiteers haven't covered themselves in glory in terms of their understanding and their ability to relate to Irish history and cultural sensitivities either. In terms of Brexit itself, I think the problem is that you now have a parliament in London and a government in London that is unable to agree a negotiating strategy for itself. And that is the primary roadblock, because they have now voted against leaving without a deal, they voted against not leaving at all, they voted against a new referendum, and they voted against the deal on the table, which I think it is at this point reasonable enough to ask, what are they in favour of? And I don't see any way out of it without a general election and a new government.
From an Irish journalist perspective, isn't it fair to say that most of them have covered it with the same angle that most Irish people would take on Brexit, that is one of being highly critical of the decision itself, and therefore those journalists are just representing popular opinion in this country?
Well, I often wonder whether journalists are representing popular opinion or creating popular opinion. Are the people following the media, or are the media following the people? Because I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the Irish media is uniformly and extraordinarily pro-European. There are some things that one simply cannot do in Ireland. One of them is to criticise the European Union. I saw a very prominent journalist recently laughing at British media, the British media being Eurosceptic, by saying things like, "Oh, well, they told lies about bendy bananas," and they didn't. The fact is that the European Union in 1994 passed a regulation against bananas that were excessively bendy. The British media covered it, the Irish media didn't. And the Irish media now says that story was a lie. And I think that there is a tendency, and bendy bananas isn't a huge deal or anything. I'm not trying to pretend there's a huge scandal. But there is a tendency in the Irish media to play down any story that might lead to a rise in Euroscepticism, and a huge tendency in the Irish media to make it seem like the European Union is absolutely essential to the way we function in our day-to-day lives. I think that's unfortunate. And I think that has very much covered their coverage of Brexit. And I also think it has influenced public opinion on the matter, because when you talk to Irish people about the European Union versus when you talk to Irish journalists about the European Union, Irish people, in my experience, never express any great love for the European Union. You don't hear them saying things like, "Oh, gee, I was listening to that speech by Mr. Verhofstadt the other day, and he's a very wise leader." Whereas when you speak to Irish journalists, it's very much pro-European. "Oh, the European project is great, peace and all the rest of it." I think with the Irish people, it's not that they're pro-European, it's that they're pragmatic enough to realise that leaving the European Union would cause significant economic difficulties, and they put that first. So I think there's a divide there between how the people see the European Union, which is as a pragmatic necessity, and how journalists see the European Union, which is as an untrammeled, almost religious good.
A lot of people will criticise the EU in this country for foisting the bailout on us and for rejecting the first decisions of the Irish people in both the Lisbon and Nice treaties. But isn't it fair to say at the same time that we're heavily dependent on the EU in terms of our economic fortunes, given the number of multinationals that provide employment here? And at the end of the day, a lot of people are just worried about providing a living for their family, and so many families are dependent on those multinationals that the EU have brought in,
Well,
essentially.
that's exactly it, Tim. I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. People are just more than anything else, they don't want the economic upheaval of a change in our relationship with the European Union, and that is the number one thing at the forefront of their minds. It's odd. I mean, there's a reason the most Eurosceptic people in Ireland are fishermen, because they're the one set of people who haven't had an economic benefit from European Union membership. It's gone the other direction, which tells you all you need to know. The perception in Ireland is that the European Union has delivered jobs and innovation and wealth, and I think that's, there's an element of truth in that it's opened markets for us, and there's an element of truth in that we have been at some points in our history a net beneficiary of structural funding from the European Union. But by and large, I think we're selling ourselves a bit short. I mean, Irish government policy, while I wouldn't agree with it in a lot of areas, has been quite economically progressive since the mid-1980s in terms of developing our economy and our tax base and all the rest of it. So I think we give the European Union a bit too much credit. On the issues you mentioned in relation to the bailout and their general attitude to democratic expressions of opposition to them, I mean, there is no doubt that the economic policy set in Brussels is disadvantaging whole sections of the European population. In Greece, in Italy, in Spain, you have basically a monetary policy in Brussels that is out of step with economic reality on the ground at the fringes of Europe. And while Ireland at the moment is not a net, I suppose we're not suffering from that as much as other countries, there is the fact, and I mean, nobody is talking about this, that our economic crisis was caused by the fact that we had an economic boom from the year 2000 to the year 2008, and interest rates set in Europe that were far too low for what the economy was doing. And if you look at the economy of Ireland today, we have growth rates before, at one point, I think last year there was a projection of 8% growth, and our interest rates are sub-zero. If we had control of our own monetary policy, there is no way our interest rates would be where they are today. And many of the conditions that underpinned the first crisis are being repeated at the moment. And there's a structural problem at the heart of the European economic model, which is that interest rates are set for the centre, for France and Germany, and not for the peripheral countries like ourselves and the Greeks and the Italians and so on and so forth. And if that alignment steps out, if that continues down that road, I mean, 2008 won't be a one-off.
So how do you see the European elections going in terms of the broader picture around Europe, not just in Ireland?
I think that there will be an increasing expression of discontent. I think there are an awful lot of things bubbling under the surface in Europe that we don't talk about. I think all around what one might call the outer ring of Europe, from Poland to Hungary to Greece to Italy in particular, there's a growing dissatisfaction and concern with European immigration policy. And I'm making no comment on whether those are appropriate concerns or whether they're fair concerns, but they definitely exist, and they definitely do not. They're definitely not reflected in the political discourse of European elites. And there's also growing dissatisfaction with the European Union for the reasons I previously mentioned about economic policy. So I do think that just as in national elections right across Europe over the last couple of years, you're going to see a significant swing to extremes on both sides. And I think that will be destabilizing and ultimately not to anyone's particular good, but it's also very understandable because the European Union has failed utterly to address the concerns that people have with it because it's structurally incapable of doing so.
And so are we approaching the end of the EU, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the thing about the European Union is that it is dedicated to nothing in so much as it is dedicated to keeping itself in place. It is one of the few international organizations that wakes up every morning wondering, what do we have to do today to keep the European Union in place? I think it is so economically embedded, particularly with the euro, across the economies of Europe, that the cost of dismantling it in the short to medium term would be so high as to make it highly unlikely that anyone will do that. And I also think that while dissatisfaction and extremism are both things that are growing, for the moment at least in Europe, there remains a majority for a bare majority, but a majority for centrist parties. So I think the European Union will limp on, but I think it is being deeply weakened by what's happening with Brexit, and I think it'll be further weakened by the results of the European elections. And I think that ultimately, it's a project stuck in limbo. It's half a superstate, and that's the problem with it. And it either needs to, and I would oppose this, by the way, but it either needs to go down the full road of being a superstate, or it needs to be dismantled. But the problem is, at the moment, we're essentially stuck with something that's halfway between the two, and that's causing huge problems in terms of how Europe is governed.